Ever killed Nazis before?
Man, we were born to kill Nazis.
I really like Wolfenstein Youngblood, but I don't know if I like the game as much as I like the idea of it. Experimentation is important. In a GDC talk on the development of Prey Mooncrash, its level design lead Rich Wilson laid out 3 important pillars to its creation: motivation to evolve, preservation of core values, and adaptation to new problems. And that last one is perhaps the most interesting to me. Games have become too expensive to produce, and no longer do guaranteed franchises, developers, or genres equal guaranteed sales. A single £40 game purchase no longer covers the cost of development, and generation schemes like season passes and randomised cosmetic items aren't always a welcome option. Finding ways to innovate in the space isn't just a means to freshen the gene pool, but also to find ways to ethically reuse content that would otherwise have been a sunk cost, and to create something enticing out of a proven product. Prey Mooncrash is a fantastic example of that ethical approach to reuse in action. They took the spirit of the base game, an exploration-driven, mystery-solving, slower-paced shooter, and extended it. The mechanics and almost all the assets are the same, but what you're trying to achieve is different. It's not about leading one character through a single playthrough, but rather sending many characters through multiple loops of a simulation in order to achieve an end goal. Although it's a lot smaller in scope than the original game, I would say that it's as successful as the original in achieving what it set out to do. I would even say I like it a lot more than the original. But I get why people don't like experimentation. I mean, Bethesda tried it with Fallout 76, turning a crafted role-playing experience into an instant-driven multiplayer one. Even before we experienced the glitches and stability issues, the idea was off-putting to many. And on release, it was apparent that this was an experiment that, outside of some bright spots, didn't seem to resonate either with fans of Fallout nor the potential audience it could have had. And there's been that trepidation from fans of these games that they're taking resources out of the things they like in order to fund these experiments that just aren't for them. As if the development of these games comes at the cost of new yet familiar AAA titles, rather than a remedy to cover the cost of developing them. What I mean by this is that downloadable content, including spin-off games, can often be a profitable arm for many publishers. Well, look at EA. They make, on average, $1.3 billion on microtransactions and DLC per year. And that money has to go somewhere, and often it goes back into the development of more games, established franchises and smaller titles, Battlefields and Sea of Solitudes. As I stated earlier, these experiments aren't just a means of recouping costs though. They are also an avenue to find new and interesting ways to evolve on core principles, and in turn take what's been learned through that experiment and apply it forward. After all, first-person shooters wouldn't exist as they are today if the original Wolfenstein 3D didn't experiment with dropping the stealth of the original games for high-octane action. It's why, despite hating some of Youngblood's design, I understand why it's there, and appreciate that it is trying to do something different. I love the addition of multiplayer and a more open world structure, but I really do not like how enemies have been rebalanced for both, and how the game misses some of that storytelling that makes MachineGames' Wolfenstein titles so fantastic. So, while I don't love it, that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be an audience that might. MachineGames' take on Wolfenstein has been a shot in the arm for the series that invented the first-person shooter. After decades of American developers slowly transforming Wolfenstein into a Indiana Jones-style shooter full of occult Nazis, the European MachineGames took a more measured approach, one that could only really come from a less Hollywood and more historical approach to the material. They didn't want you to hate the Nazis because they're an overpowered video game villain, but because they're Nazis, highly motivated by their insidious ideology of fascism and white supremacy. MachineGames took measures to fully realise a world where, through their obscene experiments, the Nazi achieved victory in World War II and had fully realised their takeover of every nation. These games aren't the cheeky series of all-American soldier versus supernatural Nazi villains. They're a cathartic power fantasy in a world gone horribly wrong, where you play as the only character whose overwhelming passion to dismantle this new world order will spark a revolution. In my opinion, MachineGames' greatest achievement is taking the first true first-person shooter protagonist and making him the most nuanced first-person shooter protagonist. BJ Blazkowicz is a conflicted Jewish, Polish-American war machine who is both a supremacist's perfect specimen and their worst nightmare. A man who has achieved so much with enormous firepower, and yet treats his peers with intelligence and respect. A man who cannot achieve his mission without the help of minorities. Women, the differently abled, people of colour, and those who don't fit into the Nazis' vision of a perfect Aryan utopia. A man who despises everything a poisoned supremacist mindset has achieved, and yet could be considered an extension of it.
Just like your mother.
It's pretty heavy stuff for a first-person shooter, but MachineGames handles it well, and that's why these games are fantastic. Mechanically, it is ostensibly a first-person shooter. Outside of some scripted story moments and base sections, you'll be running and gunning through linear levels set in Nazi-occupied landmarks. The weapon choices are plentiful, and even your approach to taking out enemies is varied. Going in guns blazing is effective, and feels fantastic, but a stealth approach can help better even the odds. There's even a hint of exploration in some levels to give them a bit more shape, either hiding ammo and health, extra collectibles, or just more of the world to take in. And these games are at their best when they slow down, when you can marvel at MachineGames' attention to detail and how they figured out just how far the Nazi regime has rippled across culture. Questions like, what kind of music do people listen to? What does the advertising look like? What would happen if every building in your city was designed by Albert Speer? Again, you're not just fighting the Nazis because this is a video game. You're opposing what they've done to society, and details like this show you how sweeping their influence is. It's a great shooter though. Actually, it's a good shooter. As these games go on and the challenge ramps, that feeling of just going up against waves of enemies in arenas without much nuance to it all really starts to sink in. Stealth becomes less effective as enemy populations increase, and by the end of these games it always feels less like I was pushing myself to fight for the revolution, and more like going through the motions waiting for the next big story beat. It felt like the grind of lesser games, and a loop of death and reloads, with dwindling ammunition and patience, fighting off hordes of the game's biggest and baddest. It's why these quiet moments were important. Those moments of stealth, and even those base sections to pace out the intensity of all that shooting. Every poster, every person, every cutscene, and of course, every new way the plot could keep me going. These are great games, and even as an experimental side project, there was no reason to believe that Youngblood wouldn't be the same. Not only was it being produced by MachineGames, but it was also being co-developed by Arkane, the talent behind the Dishonored series, Prey, and its DLC Mooncrash. Two developers whose work I love, working together on a series I adore. What could go wrong? I really like Wolfenstein Youngblood, but I don't love it. And I hate that.
Pick your head up, Jess. Come on now.
This time round, you're not playing as BJ Blazkowicz. Instead, you play as one of his twin daughters, Jess and Sophia. To reiterate, they're not BJ Blazkowicz, and this is both great and not so great. One of the most interesting aspects of MachineGames' storytelling has been their introspection into the mind of its protagonist, and it is often at the forefront of many of the cutscenes and dialogue pieces. Youngblood isn't concerned with that kind of introspection that BJ got over the course of almost 4 games. That said, there is not really a lot to be introspective about with the Terror Twins yet. They haven't lived the life their father has, and nor do they have that isolation in his struggle with the Nazis. By design, they will always have another person that they can rely on. But what you do understand is that they're characters born into this post-Nazi regime and post-American Revolt world, and they have different sensibilities because of that. They're neither hardened murderers brought up by Terror-Billy, nor are they detached wish-fulfillment characters. They are very odd though, and I like that.
Let's read this sticky wicket.
Fuck yeah!
You guys are weird.
Wolfenstein has always had some moments of levity, and although I did say earlier that MachineGames' take on the material is heavy compared to its contemporaries, they've never shielded away from using humour.
Well, the toilet works.
They're not making a misery shooter after all, they are making a cathartic power fantasy, and a balance needs to be found between showing you the sheer horror of what you've been tasked with having to overcome, but also showing you things worth fighting for. They use it to make characters more human and likeable, and they also use it to make the Nazis more cowardly and reprehensible. Perhaps because of its change in gameplay though, Youngblood is lighter than previous games so far. It bends around the personality of its protagonists, leaning into a tone that borders on a light action movie aesthetic that fits the time period, although it's a story about teen girls off to fight super Nazis. And I don't just mean this tone aesthetically, but also in its more playful approach to problem solving. For the first time in the Machine Games series, Youngblood is a multiplayer co-op game. Even in solo play, the other sister is always there as an AI partner, and working as a team is baked into the very design of the game. They have all the tools at their disposal that their dear old dad did, but what he never had was somebody watching his back. One player can take out enemies from a distance while another goes in guns blazing, or both can coordinate attacks on larger enemies from different angles. Another thing that's different? The level design, and its approach to completing objectives. It owes a lot to experiments done in the new Colossus, and as well as build on what Arkane has done with its own Dishonored series. Although the new Colossus was a strictly linear experience, there were Enigma machine missions that would send you back to previously completed levels with remixed conditions and looks, a way to reuse content already developed for the game in a fresh way. While not every mission was a winner, it certainly added more value to the end product. Dishonored Death of the Outsider, on the other hand, had a contract system, a series of additional objectives you could take whilst on a mission. These were there to encourage more exploration of these multi-tiered spaces. Youngblood doesn't have strictly linear missions outside of a few unique cases. Instead, it is set in a segment of Nazi-occupied Paris, made up of small and connected sandboxes. You're not intended to go through these once, they're used and reused for small missions and tasks that all push towards helping the resistance and ousting the Nazis from the French capital. I really like this approach. Having two players already pushed the need to open corridors and layer the arenas more, but having multiple paths through an environment is really satisfying to engage with. It's less of the curated grind of the original and more of an invitation to experiment yourself. It makes an initial cloaked attack more viable when you can shoot from on high and on far. It makes getting around in action safer when there's more angles to hide behind. And it makes running away an actual viable option for progression. And unlike their dad, Jess and Soph even have more options for getting around these bigger spaces. Again, something that was experimented both in the previous Wolfenstein and in Arkane's own games. In the latter half of the new Colossus, you can unlock augmentations to BJ's abilities. One that can blow through gratings, extendable stilts, and one to squeeze through tight gaps. And these are adapted to Youngblood as a double jump, stealth camo, and a barge. And they're not just offensive and defensive measures, but they're needed for getting around Paris in the smartest way possible. And, well, you'll want to do so. Arkane's influence really shines in the level design. Machine Games already had a knack for creating spaces that weren't just corridors and arenas, but the Dishonored developers make Paris feel like, well, Paris. There's cramped apartments, shantytowns, office buildings and more, lived in places with history both before and after the Nazi occupation. Importantly, the two studios' knack for occupying its spaces with bespoke assets really fires on all cylinders here. Across all of Machine Games' Wolfenstein titles, we understand how almost 50 years of Nazi occupation changes the world. Even in the post-liberated America of Youngblood, it doesn't look like our own. In the bits that we see, it's scrappy and built on the liberated technology the Nazis used to hold it in control. And going back, the Nazi America of the New Colossus wasn't just the 1960s with swastikas either. It mutated structures that were already there, like the Washington Monument, and found ways to perverse them through fascism. It took an all-American town and put stormtroopers and the KKK in plain sight. And a similar thing could be said of Dishonored's Dunwall. It's not just Victorian England with walker drones, but you can see how this post-warning society embraced technology and design language that pushes a feeling of utter isolation and depression. In Youngblood, both ideologies in world design are in play. It shows just how insidious a fascist ideology is, not just how it's affected a people, but even Paris. They've disrupted the architecture of the City of Lights with their gaudy concrete walls and opulent golden eagles. And then there's those monolithic towers breaking over its skyline, perhaps the most noticeable example of their fascist architecture. To me, well, it can be more effective than a cutscene telling you how bad things have gotten, because you can see it for yourself. So, what's the problem? Well, a decision was made for Youngblood to add leveling to the mix. This makes sense after all, unlocking new passive abilities as the game goes on keeps people invested, and opens new wrinkles to the fight matrix. That, and making sure a player goes through an open world in a somewhat curated manner is important. Otherwise, well, they're gonna chew all the taste in the gum and get bored with the same environments. But having enemies with levels over their heads takes a lot of fun out of engaging with them. It makes a stealth or an overwhelming approach amount to pretty much the same result, and, well, even worse, it tries to push you towards engaging with microtransactions that frankly didn't really need to be included. But more importantly, it undermines the message of the previous games, that the Nazis are a legitimate and very grounded threat. As stated earlier, MachineGames' MO with their previous Wolfensteins was building up the Nazi not just as a video game villain, but as a truly monstrous ideology. They put you face to face with some of their most decorated officers and showed you just how reprehensible they could be. Even when they stomped around in giant mech suits, they were still treated as a very serious threat. But in Youngblood, because of its somewhat typical player versus everyone approach to shooting, it makes them feel like those video game villains that should be relegated from these Wolfenstein titles. A main antagonist set up in the early moments of the game isn't given the opportunity to show you how despicable he is, because your only interaction with him will be shooting him in a cramped arena. It just doesn't pull its weight when compared to what came before. It lets down any of that world building done through impeccable asset and level design, and instead leaves the whole game feeling, well, quite artificial. But I can understand why it's there. Sticking to the main missions is a trip to the grinder. The Brother Towers are a test of your resource management and your patience, and you can't rush through them the way you could with the action-orientated levels of the previous games. If you and your sister die on mission, you're not just going back a few minutes. You're getting sent all the way back to the beginning, with every Nazi in between back on their feet and ready to wear you down once again. But if you play by the rules and go for lower risk side jobs, well, you're gonna have a nicer time. This is where that curated aspect sneaks back up. It's an open world, open objective Wolfenstein, but you are expected to play by the game's terms. You're not going to take down the Nazis in a single playthrough, and you're certainly not going to bond with the people of the French resistance unless you help them out. That's why they make the tower missions the most difficult, so you actually have to rely on the resistance to help you. In one instance, they shot a laser through an enormous door that opened the way ahead to one of these towers. Something that, well, I have no idea how I would have achieved that otherwise. Through the power of game mechanics alone, it teaches the Terror Twins that they're not going to win a war through sheer firepower. It's through networking. It's not by destroying the Nazis for a single linear attack, but through transgressive acts and experimentation. When the odds seem stacked against you, you work together to overcome. The same learning their dad had to go through in the New Order, the New Colossus, and hopefully his next adventure in the series. It's why, as annoying as some of the game design is, I can't hate Wolfenstein Youngblood. It achieves everything that is in the game's selling point, a cooperative Wolfenstein adventure from the Machine Games and Arkane people. It managed to evolve in the game that came before it in a meaningful way. The linear approach of the New Order and the New Colossus made the usual endgame monotony of being thrown against waves of high-powered enemies pretty unbearable. And well, that's not much of an issue in the more open-world Youngblood. Having more than one objective to complete in more than one single level means that you're never going to have to get hung up on a particularly tricky section. You don't have to wait for those quiet moments on bases and in little apartment buildings. You can just go there and soak it all in. If they make another Wolfenstein title, I would much rather it be a better Youngblood than the same Order of Colossus with new set pieces. And well, though not everyone might agree with this, I felt pretty satisfied with the conclusion of BJ's story in the new Colossus, and I'd be happy to see more of the twins go through their arc, or even characters aligned to the Revolution get their star turn. But I think to win people over put off by this new approach to Wolfenstein, they'll need to reconsider the importance of storytelling. After all, many people including myself come to MachineGames' Wolfenstein series on the strength of its writing, its characters and its set pieces, and it's what's worrying about this game. Without those cutscenes and those slowdown moments of the New Order and Colossus, it has to rely on environmental storytelling and brief interactions as a substitute, and I don't think either do enough. The thing is, maybe I'm more receptive to a bold experiment than the competent but familiar. I may be the only person who went to bat for Banjo-Kazooie nuts and bolts, and well, it's not going to be the last experiment I cover positively. But let me tackle the buzz of Youngblood being another Fallout 76 misstep by Bethesda. It's frankly untrue. If you can jam with this game, experience for what it is rather than a co-op new Colossus, you're going to find stuff you like. The shooting is still there, those special abilities are improved, and while there's none of that astonishing story moments of the last game, there are still those slow and considered moments. And if you're a fan of Arkane's work, then you should support another great game by them. There are rather vagrant microtransactions included in this game, and it's hard not to think that the design of the enemy levels was built to capitalise on this, engaging with those people who don't have the time or ability to see the whole game through. Personally, I never found I needed to engage with them in order to have a good time, though of course, your mileage will vary. But I will say, don't be spooked by an AI partner. They're absolutely fine, at least in my playthrough so far. So, I don't know, maybe the next time your favourite developer wants to try something new with a franchise you like, don't immediately write it off as unworthy. Fallout 76 and Prey Mooncrash are wildly different in their level of success, but they are both examples of reusing pre-existing assets and applying some creative innovations to make something both cost-effective and, more importantly, fun. And that is exactly what Wolfenstein Youngblood is. Which is why I really like Wolfenstein Youngblood. I don't love it, I don't hate it, and I really, really hope that it's going to influence what comes next.